All right, so it looks like it's time to get started. So I'll remind us where we were last week. So when we ended last time, we started talking about the Roman Basilica and how they changed this log fort basically into a place of worship. And so early Christians borrowed a lot of things from the Romans, and so they were trying to convert people to Christianity. So they tended to use things that people were familiar with, and then they would use that and incorporate or change it into Christian themes. So we had talked about how in some of these basilicas, they were wood roofed, and so they were prone to fire, and that was a difficult thing. One thing I didn't mention is that the pastors were able to sit down during the sermon and preach, and so that might have been helpful. But when we move to some of these outside, the outside drawings of the old basilica plan, when we look at this, it's very similar to what we may have seen in the tabernacle design. So that's why I talked about that a little bit too, where as they walked into through these arches in the front, the arches for the Romans meant something of triumph, and for Christians it meant victory. And so as you enter through the arches, you're actually entering as a symbol of Christ's victory over death. But then as you went into this atrium area that you see over here, the atrium with this fountain was a place where people could wash and symbolically clean themselves before they went into the rest of the church. But if you were unbaptized, you had to stay out in this atrium area. You weren't allowed to go into the rest of the church where all of the believers were at. And so there was that separation between, your people who were baptized or people who were community members, where they could exist or where they could be in the church. And so this plan of this very long church like this, really sticks in our minds as kind of being the ideal or the, kind of the original design of the church. And so as things move along, we've adapted things for our purposes, right? We change things as needed. And so, we don't keep it in the same way. So this idea of keeping the exterior unadorned, making it plain, was also something that you saw in this Roman Basilica church. It was like the tabernacle, where the outside was unadorned and plain, the inside was beautiful. And so having this as, having this gateway that came in from the outside led into this, this nave that was colonnading. And the nave always symbolizes too that idea of this ship that guides us through the world. A lot of times we look in some of these older churches and they have that, a lot of these exposed beams and whatnot, and it almost looks like this ship. And so navy, we make that connection between the two, right? So in this, again, 40,000 people could stand inside of there, and so no seats, but packed in very closely for that. And so, these arches in the front, then inspired by these triumphal Roman arches, where generals would build these arches to commemorate their victories. And some of the most popular ones, we saw the Arch of Constantine a couple times ago, but Titus also had an arch that he built when he ransacked the temple. And so you can see some of the historical things in there where they were carrying away a lot of the gold and silver implements from Herod's temple too. So people really stood or sat on the floor until the 16th century. We talked about that before. But believers gathered outside the church and invoked God's name. And then during the introit, as they would speak the introit or sing the introit, they would move into the church just as Christ enters. And so during baptism, all would turn and face the east wall. And facing that east wall symbolized our burial with Christ in death. Death is conquered by the Son who rose and still rises. And again, that idea of turning toward the east and having death being conquered by the Son as the sun rises in the east. And so all of this symbolism is, coming into play. They thought about this as, and as the sun continues to rise, we think about how Luther talks about we daily put the old Adam to death, and then we rise again with a new life in Christ. And so that idea, as the sun rises, we remember this, our
washing of baptism, and how we kill the old Adam that way, or of original sin. So only baptized would pray the Lord's Prayer and celebrate Holy Communion. Believers would move up to the altar and the table. Unbaptized were dismissed to the atrium. During the offering, the early church would bring food and material needs and money, and they would place that on that table of prosthesis. So again, that table of prosthesis that we saw in the tabernacle with the bread and wine that was used for the priest was now repurposed for needy people who needed some of these things. Members would hold hands as they spoke the creed. I think that's kind of a cool thing. You're all pledging this together. And it's interesting too. I always think about this when we say the creed. One time I had someone who doesn't go to church a lot come to church with us, and they said, it was really strange during the creed. It sounded like you guys are all members of a cult or something. And so, well, but that's we all believe the same thing. And for me, that's so interesting that we've said this for thousands of years. And we've said the same thing for thousands of years, and so, that's who we are. It's not a cult, but it's a group of believers who believe all the same thing. So that holding hands is kind of really an interesting point. So the early church buildings, though, they did change from becoming this house of the believers to really the idea became this almost house of God, this Domus Dei. And so it became, a big shift from this domestic character of church, where it was part of your daily life, to this larger meeting place where people would gather together. And so our belief of church is this community of saints. Like Pastor said today, we are the church. This building, is a representation of that. But, like you said too, this is not your church, it's Christ's church, right? And we belong to it, and that was one of the things too, in college when you're talking about who is a member of the Synod. Well, if you're a member of the Synod, you're a pastor, a teacher, you're on that roster. A congregation's a member of the Synod, and as soon as you stop being that, you're no longer that member of the Synod, or you get removed from the roster, right? So some of us who are lucky enough get to be emeritus, and we get to stay on there. But, once you stop teaching, like Rachel, as she stopped teaching, now her name is no longer on that roster. Okay? So is that a record keeping thing? Yes. But, does that mean she's not a member of the church? No. It just means that for synodic purposes, she's not a member on the roster. Okay. But association encourages the shrine concept of God. You house the deity within the sacred space. So now God is placed within this church. Not, that idea of him being within our hearts starts to move away a little bit. So, that's the danger of this type of event too. So instead of being part of all of life, you separate it into religious and secular. Where now, okay, I go to church on Sunday, and then the rest of the day I'm not in church. And so, you think about it that way instead of, Christ's being in us, encompassing all of our life, or what we do through all of our life. And so that idea too of, Christ shining through us, I think is something that, we should be aware of too, like our actions and how we present ourselves. People should know that, right? So that was one of the things too, where you mentioned Portland this morning. So that brought back some, things that I thought about when I was in grad school out there. And, it was funny because the people said to me during this was my last defense of my thesis, basically. And so I'm showing my artwork and talking about it. They said, well, why did you talk about your faith? And I thought, well, that's really strange because, I tried to talk about that earlier, then you kind of got shut down because of that. And then they said, well, it's such a part of you. Why don't you talk about that more? Like, oh, I don't know, So they said, well, we know that you're a Christian. Everybody knows that. And it's like, well, I didn't go out and tell everybody that. And they said, well, we know how you act. And I thought, well, that's really something, that they know by your deeds, right? And so that idea of not separating, here I am a Christian at church on Sunday, rest of the week I'm someone else, but it should shine through you, right? And I think that that's the part where we move into this next area, where when we talk about culture and the Christian artist, and how does the Christian artist bring culture into it, or how do you deal with the culture? Okay, and so there's really three ways of dealing with it too. So when we talk about culture, we talk about how language and thoughts, patterns, habits, values, and social institutions all combine to create culture. So individuals develop with these elements that are subtle but in constant change. And I don't have to tell you that things have been in change, sometimes not so subtle, sometimes not so slow either. Things are really changed. There are words that have been developed now that people use that 10 years ago didn't exist. Okay, and those are things that we sometimes struggle with it, right? So art is this integral part of culture, and art should be a reflection of the culture. But sometimes we also have other ways of dealing with things, and so I'm going to talk about that a little bit too. So the artist develops within the social tradition and within the artistic tradition. So in Christian approaches to this culture, we can do one thing. We can reject culture. Okay, we can withdraw from society of the world altogether. We can become like the Amish and say, I'm going to set myself apart from the world. I can enter a monastery and I can set myself apart from the world. I can get away from it completely. So Anabaptists, Mennonites, also, other forms of Amish, Pennsylvania Dutch, usually reject our art on the grounds that it comes from pagan sources, and so we shouldn't have any of that. Again, that's happened in the Lutheran Church too during the Reformation. A lot of people, Karl Stott, for instance, thought that we should, get rid of all the stained glass, burn all the artwork. And Luther came back and said, "What are you doing? Don't do that." And so, but there is that, especially that feeling in Reformed churches that we shouldn't have this art here. And that has kind of been a little bit about in Lutheran churches. That's why Catholic churches really have a lot of ornamentation. Lutheran churches, for the most part, sometimes don't, and so it's because we sort of are still struggling with that little pietistic thing that we're going to create some idols in our church if we have these images. And so not necessarily, true. Again, Luther said most people can tell the difference. But, some people can't. They had these rusticated peasants back in the Middle Ages who saw, sculptures of the Virgin Mary and fell in love with them. And they had to build fences around them because these people tried to take the sculpture home, And they said, "I'm in love with this. I have to have this." And it's just, we think, well, that's just silly, right? But people didn't see those images a lot. They hadn't seen it before. They thought it was real, right? But second thing, absorption by culture. Christians try to relate Christians' truths to the culture. They live in the world and become part of it. And so much of Christianity in America does this today. And so we see that happening in like our the ELCA, for instance, adopting the culture, trying to live with it, trying to be part of it. In the LCMS, we're fighting against it a little bit, right? We're trying to maintain our beliefs and our doctrine against what the world says is true. Often Protestant art reflects this liberal attitude too. It hesitates on an art that suggests pain in any way. So for instance, the proponents of this art wouldn't want to hang a crucifixion or a crucifix with a crucified body on it, with a corpus on it. So art's not designed to give pain or irritation. It's supposed to be like the living room concept of a church. What would be comfortable for me? That's what I'm going to put into my church. I'm going to have a lot of lounge chairs. We're going to be pretty, soft in there. It's going to be easy, right? So yeah, right. So Christianity is designed to be pleasant, and so should the art be. And so I know this is probably going to upset some people a little bit when I start talking about this, but this Warner Salmon, Head of Christ, how many of you, is this your idea of what Christ looks like? Okay, raise your hand. We had one of these hanging in my house too, and for the longest time, this is who Christ was, right? And so this is who I believe. But, we think about it. Here is a pleasant-looking man, a handsome man. He has Anglo-Saxon features. He looks like Germans, right? And so he's a savior that's easy to accept. It's an attempt to define God within our own terms. We select what we want to see or what we want to hear. And so it's really this limited view of scriptures. Okay, it's not wrong to picture Christ like this, but there's a difficulty because if Christ looks like this, then is Christ for anybody? And is this what Christ really looked like? No, he was Jewish, right? He was Mediterranean. He probably did not look like this. And so for some people, that's tough, difficult to understand or to accept, right? Just like the peasant found it difficult to accept that Mary was a sculpture and not real, right? So, so those are the types of things where I think we have to be careful with representation in church, not because it's a bad thing, not because we're going to see it as an idol, but because we tend to place our idea of, yeah, this is what it was like, this is what it is. And so sometimes we don't leave it open to maybe bringing our ideas in or letting it connect with scripture that way. In mediation and culture, the group of Christians sees no need to separate themselves from the social order, but they are in the world and not of it. Okay, I think that's important. Be part of the world, but live in the world, but don't do the things that the world does, right? Okay, they will have a critical voice regarding the cultural institutions that are contrary to Christian truths. They believe God created the earth and the environment with the same concern and love that God had mediated to them. But God's love is now their love, and now is manifested in Christ's love for the people. And I think this third part, mediation and culture, one of the things that one of the theology profs out at Concordia Portland said, he was teaching a class, and they were talking about people in the Pacific Northwest, and one of his students who was visiting from Seward said, well, how do I witness to that person? And he said that then he immediately could see that she was not from the area. And said, well, like talking to people, sure, people out there, like we talked about starting a church, a mission church out there. Yeah, I mean, you can talk to people about it. That's okay. They'll believe you, but as long as you don't say that their beliefs are wrong, right? So, I mean, there's no either or. It is, or there is an either or, right? It's not, you can't say one way or the other. And a lot of the kids that I taught at Concordia Portland too were like, well, I'm in this non-denominational church just because I didn't like the rigidity of, Catholic church or Lutheran church and things like that. So, Fred, yeah.
I thought that since God created man, that we had artists or people. Was there not any artists that took drawings of Christ while he was on the earth?
Well, we talk about St. Luke was known as being the artist, and St. Luke apparently did some drawings of people, and whether those survived or not, probably not, but yeah, you would guess that he was probably seen as the patron of artists because he was thought to have done some, the Renaissance people thought that they had done some drawings. So,
well, but we have so many pictures of Jesus. Obviously, we haven't gotten right at what truly makes.
Yep.
Well, and also, when enough time has passed, even somebody who was famous in their own time, we don't have any sort of depiction of them. So Isaiah was very famous in his own day, but all we have of him that we can, outside of the biblical text, verify that this prophet really did exist and he had a relationship with the royal court. We uncovered a seal, like that you use to seal a letter, and it's Isaiah's personal seal. We have Isaiah's seal, we have King Hezekiah's seal. That's all we have in an archaeological record. It's one of the reasons why some of these, like Romans and stuff, they did these big sculptures and things because they did want to be remembered, for forever. Of course, a general contractor from Galilee, he didn't have the money to make a profit of himself,
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Right, and the things like the Shroud of Turin we talk about too as being possible things like that. And I think the reason that especially early Christians probably didn't keep a lot of those too, because like Pastor Will said, the Romans had these, they called them like really true to life sculptures of their ancestors. And they would keep those in their houses and they would worship those ancestors. And I think the early church probably also had this kind of a prohibition or like an uneasiness about creating an image of Christ because they were worried that people would worship the idol rather than worshiping the Christ, the risen Christ. And so I think that's probably, you're talking to a lot of people who have that Jewish idea too against, having some images of God and depicting God. And so, you're working with, okay, on one hand, I have all these Jewish Christians who don't have images in their churches. On the other hand, I have a lot of these Roman Christians who use those pagan images for worshiping their ancestors. So there probably was a lot of let's try to come up with something that's representative and not necessarily realistic. But but there have been throughout time, we do talk about these things that have been discovered. Yeah, yeah.
Back just a second. I've said this to everybody before, but I want to take this opportunity since we have this. Who painted this again?
Werner Stallman.
Werner Stallman.
Yeah.
So I've referenced this painting before too, and there is something beautiful about the idea that we don't have a representation of what Jesus actually looked like, and that every culture comes up with a Jesus that looks like them. So if you look at Hay Key's work, who's I can't figure out, is he South Korean or Chinese? He studied at the University of Nanjing. Anyway,
Yeah.
Have you seen some of his
I
paintings?
haven't.
So if you look at Hay Key's work, Jesus always looks Chinese. Or if you look at a nativity scene, like if you go and visit Sudan, like South Sudan in Africa, and you can buy a nativity scene there. There's a lot of Christians there. You can buy a nativity scene for Christmas. But Jesus and Joseph and everybody, all the men, will have the ritual scarring of the Sudanese, and they're all black fellas. And they have ritual scarring across their foreheads. That's not accurate. As long as you know that you're adopting Jesus as one of the tribe, it's okay to adopt Jesus as one of the tribe. There's nothing wrong with the German Jesus if that's what you got hanging in your house. Just do it with a little bit of a sense of humor and say, well, we like him so much, kind of like the Mary statue.
Yeah.
We just took him home. That's all we did. We liked him so much, we just took him home. And then that's okay because the Sudanese make him look Sudanese, the Chinese make him look Chinese. I've seen Japanese Jesus, and he's got like the full silk robes on, and he's looking very samurai.
Right.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. Very, very Keanu, like he kind of looks like that guy. But so it's okay to adopt Jesus as one of the tribe, I'd say. You just got to know that that's what you're doing. The only thing that you get in trouble with is if you think Mary's statue is real.
Yeah.
And it's not, it's
No.
a statue.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this isn't what Jesus looked like. It's okay. He was Jewish. He probably had really curly hair. Isaiah's prophecy said he had no outward beauty to attract us to him. So he was pretty average Joe looking. And he had stinky feet because he walked everywhere he went and he had sandals. Okay.
Mhm. Yep.
So, and he probably had BO because he didn't have deodorant with aluminum in it. I don't know if you ever thought of that. If you ever get on a plane to certain places in the world, you'll remember it real quick because a plane is an enclosed space. Not everybody in the world uses deodorant like you do. So he probably had some BO, right? But he was a cool dude, and he's our dude. And so if we want to take him home, you can take him home. That's okay.
So there are some types of art that we see in the Bible. One of them is representational. Oh, question over here. Yeah.
What's your take on the strategy?
Like the Shroud of Turin. So a lot of these relics, I believe, are probably, okay, this is how I feel about it. I think that, I know that Jesus died. I know that he was wrapped in a linen cloth. My guess is that a lot of the relics that have been, that came up around those times were probably developed because there was a big relic industry and people were looking for the splinters of the true cross. They were looking for the bones of John the Baptist. They were looking for anything that could help make their faith stronger. Okay, because I think in this case, they're trying for scientific proof that Jesus existed. And I think that faith is faith for a reason. Faith is faith in the belief that Jesus did this. I don't need to have the physical proof, although there are proofs because people saw him alive. But I do believe that Shroud of Turin probably was made later when this big relic industry
Okay, so if it helps you in your faith, I say I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but at the same time, I don't think that it's actually really real. Now, I'm going to get into trouble here because when I drive the van in the morning and these little fourth graders start asking me about fairies and Santa Claus, I have to really watch my step, right? So I could get in trouble, but that is my personal belief. Again, if it's, I don't think it's something that, as long as it doesn't become an idol, I don't think there's any harm in it, right? But if it's what you're basing your faith on, and you say, the only proof that I have is that the Shroud of Turin is real, and then if carbon dating shows that it's not, then I think there could be an issue. You might say, like this fourth grader said to me, well, what if you've been lying to me all the time about Santa Claus? And I'm like, oh no, now I'm in trouble, right? Okay. So, and that's where I think you run into trouble. Okay. So in representational art, we don't necessarily have photographic realism, but we have things that kind of represent things. And so part of this is just their artistic style and the way that they portrayed humans, but they also tried to get as much of the message in as they possibly could. There were things in this Temple of Solomon, these pillars of Yachin and Boaz, who had carvings of lily works and pomegranates on those. So some of these things that we've seen before, like the lampstands, had these almond blossoms. The laver was supported by 12 oxen, and the cherubim were on top of the mercy seat. And so all of these things have representation, and representational art is acceptable to God until we cross over and worship the object and not the God that it represents. Okay. So the style makes people who study Christians the most uneasy because it becomes a form of idolatry because it is so tangible. So any representation of God, though, was really avoided. Okay, because who can contain God within a space? Like when Job talks about it, God said, "Where were you at the beginning of the world?" And this idea of God, I think, is too much for our human brains to wrap around. And so we try to make something that looks like him because we have to try to make it concrete. So those of you, again, educators, when you're first talking to somebody about something, you give them a concrete example because the abstract is too difficult. It is. And so we only come into abstraction when we know enough about the world. And so that idea, God is so powerful, so huge, becomes such an abstract thought, our minds cannot comprehend it, right? And I give up trying to, right? But and so in that case, we don't have that representation there. But God communes to us through his word. He gives us the means of grace. He gives us the means of salvation. And so, some of this stuff we don't really need, right? So there's another type of art called abstract art. And so these are typically things you would have found in the medieval era. They would have used these carpet pages in their illustrations of the Bible. And so you have this color and texture and form. Hebrews would have liked this type of art, but the people in the medieval ages also loved it because of the complexity of it. And so, you had monks in the scriptorium working for hours and hours and hours copying the Bible, but also creating these beautiful color pages that they said enhanced the scripture, but some theologians were like, wow, I'm looking at the pictures more than I'm reading the words now, right? And so, but that could happen too. There's a third type of art, symbolic art. And so something in symbolism stands or has meaning beyond itself. It usually points to the fulfillment of the gospels in the body of Jesus Christ, or within the works of Jesus Christ. And so this marriage of Arnolfini by Jan van Eyck has all sorts of symbolism within it. And so these two people are pledging their troth to each other. And he was a wealthy merchant, and we can tell because there are oranges on the windowsill, and usually in the Low Country, they didn't have access to oranges, so oranges had to come from Spain. So we know that he had some trade there. You have an orange here on the window, and that's symbolic of that too. The light streaming in has a lot of meaning behind it. That this is the light of God coming in through the window. But there are other things that symbolize this holy union between the two people. Okay, their clogs that they would have given to each other on their wedding are off of their feet, and they're sitting down on the floor, so they are in fact on holy ground at this point.
This little dog that's in the middle between them is a symbol of their fidelity. So the word fido is, short for fidelity. So they're pledging that they're going to be faithful to each other the rest of their lives, right? On this mirror up here, you have Jan van Eyck was such a great artist and had his, really tiny miniatures. So in this little mirror right here, you can actually see the back of Arnold Beatty and his wife, but then you see Jan van Eyck back there behind them. But each of these little parts were the stations of the cross. So those areas were painted so perfectly that you can still see this. And then up here, he writes his signature. He says Jan van Eyck was here. And then up in this candelabra up here at the top, one candle is still lit, but another one has gone out. And that indicates that the Spirit of God is in the room. The Holy Spirit is coming. So all of this is kind of going into that symbolism behind it. So is this a religious painting? No, it was made for Arnold Beatty. It's a secular painting, but this is one of the first times that religious paintings were sold to people who had enough money to buy it. Previous to this, most art was bought by the church because they were the only ones who could afford it. And so they would. This is The Marriage of Arnold Beatty by Jan van Eyck. Okay. So we have some other things that we talked about already that sort of have that same sort of symbolism. The shewbread calls to mind the Holy Communion that we celebrate. The golden lampstands, Jesus as the light of the world, and then that bronze laver that we talked about, the need for us to be cleansed, the need for our baptism. And so, we also have some of these other symbols and metaphors that we talked about. The bronze serpent, for instance, pointed to Christ and whatnot. So in our church too, we have some things that have symbols and metaphors in them, right? And so Kate saw, oh, you're going to talk about the banners this morning. And then she said, who designed those? And waiting for the laughter, who designed those? Yeah, years and years ago, right? Yeah, I didn't sew them. I can't sew, but I did design them, right? And so she said, I have forgotten. And so, but then I thought, I haven't ever talked about the meaning behind these. Maybe you've looked at them and tried to come up with it. Maybe you have the same thing already. But starting with this one on the right side here. So on the morning of Easter, the sunlight comes in, and the crack is that rending of the tomb, the opening of the tomb. Okay. Down here you have the red of the blood of the sacrifice of Christ is over. And out of that tomb is coming the resurrected Christ, the body, symbolized by the butterfly who goes into its chrysalis and comes out as this beautiful butterfly. On this other side, you have these kind of strange looking brown items down here, right? But that is the seed that goes into the ground and dies. And then when it dies in the ground, the sprout comes up and starts growing up out of it. And then also you have that connection between the butterfly on the one side and the butterfly on the other side as Christ's resurrection, transformation into this new body, and what he has done for us goes into where we start to show our good works to the world in the way that we react to his sacrifice for us. The Holy Spirit moves through us. We grow up into this, the sprout comes out of the seed. We grow into this, and we incorporate then this butterfly into our own lives. It becomes something that the world sees. So we go from that kind of that worm that eats, crawls along the ground to this thing of beauty that flies around. So things are changed, and we have changed, and hopefully that comes forth within that in our banners. And so, you may have been staring at these it's been 20 years now, so that you've seen this. So, and you probably have come up with your own ideas about what this is.
Talking about the stock, or what are those different colored shapes in the white space? The white space has always intrigued me. I've never known what's going on there.
So a lot of this is, it's this combination of trying to get the stem, the stalk of the leaf of the. I was thinking about like a bean plant, but I also worked in the cornfields for years, so that couldn't help but influence me. But then it was also the separation between the butterfly wings and trying to get that and the bean plant to start to integrate a little bit between themselves. Okay. Some places, like up here at the top, I think when Sherry was creating this or quilting it too, she added a lot of texture, which was really went beyond what I was thinking of for the design itself. And so, adding this purple up here, I think I was just trying to tie into some of the purple that was going in on this other one too. But at times, I think also, this becomes, sometimes things are not symbolic. Sometimes, a color is just a color, but also sometimes you put it down there and later on you start to relate that a little bit more to. But a lot of these colors are trying to push back into that butterfly on the other side so that, you can see that it has become, that transformation has occurred, right? And then our works are showing through us. This beautiful butterfly has come to us through what Christ has done for us too.
They were intended to be seen together.
Yes, they were both intended to, and especially, as we put it on both sides of the sanctuary, that we think about how the means of grace are there in front of us and how that has translated to what we're seeing through Christ's work, right? So symbolism also happened in the Gothic cathedral, and so we see that it also had this idea of a metaphor of a man's soul. History and nature were a vast symbol to medieval man. His art and architecture was loaded with content, and so cathedral stood high above everything else in town. It also suggested this spiritual unification. It also suggested pride in the community. And it also had this idea of they talked about cathedrals as being not quite in the slime of earth, but not quite in the glory of heaven, although you felt yourself transformed as you walked into that space. And I think that's kind of the beauty of some of these things that we see as as we look at that. And so a lot of our church architecture earlier is really influenced by these ideas of the cathedral, because medieval people, their whole life revolved around the church. They were born into the church. They died, and when they had the funerals, and everything else was connected to the church. And so people sometimes think of that as being one of the most pious times, and so maybe our church buildings should reflect that. And so that gave rise to this neo-Gothic era that I was talking about earlier, like the church that I was grew up in Kansas, that's 100 years, 150 years old. A lot of those styles are like that. Or we just saw some interior pictures from Emmanuel and Schuyler, neo-Gothic. It's taking upon some of the same things that the Gothic cathedral would have done because of the symbolism that they felt that was so clear to the people in the medieval age. So when we look at some of these entrances to the doorways of the cathedrals, we're also seeing things that were made intentionally to send a message to people in that time period. And so we know that a lot of the people at that time were not literate, and so they didn't read or write. And so they used images and symbols to tell those stories then too. So they were interested in placement, symmetry, and numbers. And they were also preoccupied with hierarchy, where you place things in relationship to the central figure. So you see Christ here, and I just think this is an interesting thing too. They have Christ, and you can tell that it's him because he has his mandorla, and he's riding the nimbus right here, and then he's riding on this mandorla, which was their way of saying, how does Christ get through space and time? And so they create this kind of magical bubble that he kind of comes through with, right? And that's, again, something I don't understand, right? Physicists might, but they still don't understand it either. Because, again,
I've never called him Bubble Jesus.
You will think of it. That's right. Yep. So to medieval thinkers, everything in the world was a symbol. And so there was a visible and invisible meaning to everything. The sun, the moon, constellations, day and night, and all the seasons had a symbolic language. So during winter, when the days got short and the nights were long, medieval thinkers connected this to the long centuries of the half-light when the prophecies were revealed that Christ was coming, but he hadn't been there yet, right? Those dark days in December were called Advent, which was the waiting of the ancient world. This is the beginning of the story of the church here.
Medieval Christians believed that Jesus was born at the winter solstice, just at the time when light began to increase in the world. And again, we talk about how the Romans, and I hope I'm not going to shatter any illusions here either, but Christmas, Jesus probably wasn't born on Christmas Eve. That was, again, a Roman way to incorporate more Christians into the celebrations that were already happening at that time. So that Roman celebration that happened on the 24th of December was probably a good way to say, oh, let's put this in here and change this so that people will be okay with worshiping Christ at this time rather than worshiping their other pagan gods. Okay. The right placement next to Jesus always held the highest dignity. And so the highest place was also the most honorable. And so you have these four beasts who are symbolizing the four evangelists around Christ. And so the arrangement was usually according to the existence of animals. The human, of course, is seen as the most excellent. And so he is at the upper right of Christ. Okay, so we're on this side, right? And so as we go along, for the next ones, you have the eagle, which is also higher, but it's to the left, the lion, and then the ox. And so you can see this in the arrangement of these beasts. So Matthew his symbol was the man. Okay, Mark was the symbol of the lion. Luke was the symbol of the ox, and then John was the symbol of the eagle. Okay, and so the meaning of these beasts also had a second meaning for people in the medieval ages. Man was the symbol for the incarnation. The ox was the symbol for Christ's passion because oxen were usually used as sacrifices. The lion was thought of as a symbol for the resurrection. And the reason is they thought lions slept with their eyes open, and so they never really were asleep. And so then that's, probably a little bit of good thing to know, right? Don't go around that lion because he might get you.
They didn't have Steve Irwin.
Yep. And then but the lion was also thought about as being that way because Christ seemed to sleep in death and he really did die. Christ really did die, and we don't want to start any heresies here either. But then they thought of that 3-day sleep. We talk about that, the 3-day sleep in death in some of our hymns. And then he arose and was resurrected. And then finally, the eagle for ascension. Okay. So symmetry was also regarded as this visible question. Oh, yeah. Go ahead. Why did they? That is a good question. I'm thinking because they're probably have been like transformed animals, or they maybe ascended, like animals this is probably with the second coming of Christ as he's coming back here. So I'm guessing they're being transformed into these animals that are other than animals. So a lot of times if you add wings to something, you give it extra attributes then too.
The cherubim who carry the throne of God, they have 4 faces. One is the face of a human, one is the face of an eagle, one is the face of a lion, and one is the face of an ox. So in both Isaiah and John's revelation, the cherubim who carry the throne of God have 4 faces, and those are the 4 faces.
Mm-hmm.
They're separated out here to also then represent the Gospels, but cherubim have 6 wings. So the man is pictured as not having wings. The eagle has 2, and then the lion and the ox are both given 2, and for a total of 6.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah.
You're welcome. Yeah.
So symmetry was also seen as an expression of harmony. Okay, so symmetry in this rose window, things are exactly, if you took a line down the middle, you'd see exactly the same thing on either side of it. If you saw exactly the same thing on the top and the bottom. And so here is why we chose to have the Greek cross instead of the Latin cross in the sanctuary because of symmetry. The tail of the Latin cross tends to elongate it down, and there's nothing wrong with that. And if you look in our space right in the sanctuary right now, you'll notice that Latin cross fits very well in that space because there's a very long rectangle behind the altar. But this is different. And so that symmetry that we have there the Greek cross seems to fit better there instead. Okay, here,
That's not what it's going to look like. Just making sure everybody knows that's a placeholder.
this is a placeholder. The
Yeah.
real,
But but you are going with a Greek cross.
Are going
in
with
terms
the
of
Greek
its
cross.
proportion.
Yep. It will be 8 feet by 8 feet. It will be in that space above this rear wall called the reredos. It will be designed by and built by the Center for Liturgical Art, and it will be amazing. Okay, and so it's going to be. You have to think about that it'll be placed in that area, and the same way as a lot of the other things that you're seeing here. These are not like the altar's not going to look like that. And so on. And I'm not sure if we're going to get that brand of piano either, but
Yes.
all right. Another reason that we went with the Greek cross for our design was because we already have a Greek cross in our processional cross made by Reinhold Marxhaus. And so again, we're thinking about relationships in the sanctuary. And so we're thinking about why do we don't want to mix the style of crosses if we already have one style of cross in existence there. And so when we look at that cross, we're going to keep that as the processional cross, but that definite Greek equal arms to it is the style that we wanted to hold on to. Okay. Here's the front view of that as it's going to exist. Now, there will be one change here on this area of the windows here, because there will be another mullion that is going to exist right in this area. And the reason that there's going to be a mullion that exists there is because the stained glass designer, you're getting hot off the presses, came to me at 5 o'clock this morning from the designer who lives in Portland. His name's Richard Wheatman. He was a professor at Concordia Stewart for many years. He was my professor. He was my advisor for my senior show. When he moved out to Portland, we kept in touch. And he was the first person I thought of when we were talking about stained glass windows for the church. Now, some of you are saying, well, I didn't think we were going to put stained glass. No, it wasn't part of the original plan, but we did plan to have the designs made because we're hoping that these stained glass windows can go into the church pretty soon. And I'm not going to say any more because I don't want to step on toes here or anything like that, because I don't know when the stained glass will go in, but I know that it will, right? And so this is going to be behind that cross. And so here you have the theme of light in the stained glass window. And so the glory of God, the glory of God's creation, the colors that are going to come through, it's all going to symbolize this idea of light. Okay, and so coming through this, we're going to see, especially in the afternoons, when you're looking at that, when it's coming from the southwest, it's going to stream in there and it's going to be gorgeous. And it's going to illuminate that cross that's going to be in front of it, but that cross will not obscure it. And you're going to be able to see this from all these different angles as you go along. Symmetry, again, underneath the rose window, had this, again, the expression. And so some of the things that we saw in here too, in these stained glass windows, you had the 12 minor prophets of the Old Testament were matched with 12 apostles of the New Testament. And so, am I out? I'm getting there. Okay, all right. Oh, I'm sorry.
Don't be sorry.
Yes. Come back next week,
How long are we doing this?
because
How many more Sundays do you guys?
one more time, unless they ask me to do more, but I might have to.
So say something quickly about these.
These are going to be the side windows. This first one's this division of light and the darkness in creation. And then the second one is the rainbow promise from Noah, that was given to Noah after the ark was off of the water. Right. So come back. You're going to see the rest of them next week.
All right.